Welcome back, class. We're now discussing Chapter 4, Developing Through the Lifespan, or Developmental Psychology. So, developmental psychology's major issues. We have nature and nurture, which I'm sure you've heard of before. Basically, it comes down to this. How does genetic inheritance interact with experiences to influence the development? Who you are today is going to be based on numerous factors. Now, one of the key questions is, how much is nature influencing you, and how much nurture, or how you're raised, or what you experience, will make you into the person that you will become, or that you are currently. So, on top of nature and nurture, we also have continuity and stages. Which parts of development are gradual, displaying continuity, and continuous, or which parts are abruptly in separate stages? So basically, this is asking the question, do we develop in a slow, steady, continuous process, or do we see more abrupt changes in skills and abilities as we grow and develop? The other key or major issue is stability and change. Which traits that we possess, which traits persist through life? Basically, this is asking, are the things that we are today going to be the same types of things that we are 10, 15, 20 years from now? Will we have the same attitudes, the same temperament? So that's the question that they're asking here. What stays stable in us and what actually changes? So how does this all begin? Well, it begins with prenatal development, before you are even thought of. We have the zygote that will form when egg and sperm unite. This zygote, this is conception, is the start of life. So once that does occur, we have at each prenatal stage, we have genetic and environmental factors affect our development. We see sometimes there are certain things that go on. Sometimes people consider them fads, like learning language in utero, the preference for the mother's voice and language, and some environmental sounds. Well, there's some research to support that we can see that at some point the ability to hear is going to be possessed by that unborn child. They'll be able to hear, and later they can see they have a preference for the sound of their mother's voice. We also see the development of the placenta. The placenta screens out most harmful substances, but some do slip by. So after we have the zygote and the implantation of the zygote, we see several things start to develop. One of them is the placenta that surrounds and protects the unborn child. But some things can slip by. Some things can still get through the protective placenta barrier. We refer to some of these things that cause issues in the development of that unborn child, tetragens. These tetragens are harmful substances that can go in there at certain stages of development before you're born and cause particular types of issue. One of the issues that you may have heard of before is fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, which will cause quite a bit of issue in the development of a child with certain facial features, mental retardation, and so on. So basically, anything that the mother's around while they are pregnant can be particularly harmful to the unborn child. That is why oftentimes when you are prescribed medicines or go to certain types of facilities that have certain substances around, they ask to make sure that you tell or inform someone if you happen to be pregnant. We also see that anything dealing that can cause stress in the mother also increases risk for health problems as well. So let's look at what is happening. So we have this zygote, which is the fertilized egg, which we discussed previously. It enters a 2-week period of rapid cell division and then develops into an embryo. The placenta is designed to help transfer nutrients and oxygen from mother to embryo. So this is sort of like the connection as well that helps the baby that's developing inside the mother to get nutrients and get oxygen and so on. The embryo is developing human organism from about 2 weeks after fertilization to the second month. Then we see the fetus, developing human organism from about 9 weeks after conception to birth. So we go from zygote to embryo to fetus. So once that process is gone through, and we see approximately 9 months have elapsed, we see that then we have a newborn. A baby is born. Now, this newborn has certain skills available to it, certain reflexes. The baby is not born helpless. They are helpless, that's true, but they do have some things which will aid in their survival. We see that there are going to be automatic reflex responses, such as rooting, sucking, the startle reflex, as well as grasping. These things help it to be able to survive the environment that it's now in. When you see the stimulation of the cheek of a newborn, they will turn their head and begin to suck. This is necessary for them to get nourishment. Without that particular reflex, they would have to do almost like a trial and learning activities in order to try to find how they're going to survive. So it's very convenient for us to be born with these reflexes so that we don't have to learn them. We've also seen other research has demonstrated certain things as well. With research, we've been able to identify that we see that the newborn has a preference for face-like objects. Look at the figure on this particular slide to the right. We see these three blocks arranged in a face-like features on the left one. On the right one, they've been flipped. And what we see in the research dealing with newborns, they will show a marked preference for the one on the left, the one that is more face-like. So again, we see that these newborns and the research that we are able to perform, they demonstrate that they are not without some skills already, certain preferences. These are the things that are important for us to understand, that we are born, yes, will require a great deal of assistance for many decades of our life, but we are born with certain things and reflexes, and research is able to identify that. Now, brain development. We've talked about the brain in the previous chapter. There's going to be an explosive growth in brain development prenatally. So it's as if the brain is getting ready to be booted out of the mother. So the idea is that we want to develop that brain as best we can. So this explosive growth is going to be occurring. It will continue to occur, but most of it's going to be developed well before we get out of our mother. So we have this rapid neural network branching and linking after birth. So what happens is now all these brains, these neurons, are now making connections. Neural networking and branching occurs after birth. Most rapid frontal lobes grow from about 3 to 6 years. So the frontal lobes will grow from 3 to 6 years. Development continues into adolescence and beyond. The key idea here is this. The frontal lobe, which has a lot of our planning, making plans, and judgments, is located there, according to research. This is where we can show signs of maturity. But read what this says. Development continues into adolescence and beyond, which basically says your frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. In fact, most of you listening and looking at this particular lecture, probably your frontal lobes have not fully formed yet. This may happen like into your 20s where it becomes fully formed. So a teenage brain and an adult brain are different from the perspective is that the Teenage brain has not fully formed yet. Okay, and this can be even a little bit later in the teenage years or early 20s. They have not fully formed. So that is one of the key things to remember. The teenage brain is not the same as an adult brain. That's why a teenage brain, you may see people more likely to get into certain situations as a teenager simply because their inhibitions are not fully online yet. The thing that prevents them from doing something. So they're more likely to do something that may be a little bit more risky because their inhibitions are not fully online yet. Then we have the neural pruning process shuts down unused links. One of the key things we need to also understand is that you may have, when you were much younger, gone to piano lessons or guitar lessons or even both, going to karate class, forced to join soccer or whatever the case may be, and learn all these things. The key thing is that when we are young, we have a great capacity to learn these things. Not only that, but learn multiple languages as well. The brain is still making connections and linking things. And it's important to understand that if you learn for a few years took piano lessons, you learned the piano, and then all of a sudden you don't want to do it anymore, and you stop practicing the piano, and it's been years since you've done so. Well, it could be that the neural pruning process will start to shut down unused links. You've heard of the term before, use it or lose it. Well, that's what's happening. So these neural links, these things that have been developed, these networks that have been developed based on all the things that you have been doing and learning, well, they can start to prune some of these networks to try to get rid of them if they're not being used. So the key thing here is the following. Nature and nurture interacts to sculpt the synapses. So you're going to be born with certain neurons, and certain structures in place. But as you experience things, they will help to sculpt or to shape what those networks look like. We also need to understand, too, there are going to be critical periods for some skills that we need to be available and around certain types of experiences for us to develop properly. In addition to that, we need to also understand the nature of the brain that we saw previously in the previous chapter, plasticity. When we talked about this in chapter 2, the idea that the brain can sort of mold itself to its circumstances, to find workarounds, to build new linkages. And of course, this is most best to happen when you are younger. When you're still very young, then plasticity and neurogenesis can oftentimes correct for other issues that may be going on with a particular individual. To show you how powerful nurturing is, there's this classic research that was done looking at the brain cells and brain development of rats. What it comes down to is that they would get a bunch of newborn rats and they would place them in one of two differing types of environments. One environment would be considered to be impoverished. All they had there were the basics for life, water and food, nothing else, just a basic barren type of situation. However, another group of rats would have an enriched environment, an environment where they had things to do, wheels to run around, ladders to climb up, activities. Think about it this way: being raised in an empty room or being raised in a jungle gym room. So the idea is that one was an impoverished environment and one was an enriched environment. They wanted to see how that impacts the physicality of the brain. What they were able to demonstrate was this. The impoverished rats, they did not have the same amount of connections and as many of the neurons that the enriched rat brain cells did. So they were able to weigh them as well and see there was more brain mass when it came to the enriched rats. So all of this really indicates that the things that are going on in our environment, the nurture part of nature nurture, does have a significant role on how our brain develops and grows. So we have physical development as well. So with physical development, we can look at motor development, universal motor development sequence. Basically, the idea is that we will develop in certain ways that we will be able to do certain things. The way it normally works is this: development physically works in the following form. We develop from head down. That is why young people's heads, children's head, always tend to be a little bit larger than their body, because the head is the first thing that's going to develop. And then it proceeds down to the neck, the shoulders, and so on. But also there's spine out. So you're able to control things closer to your spine and then things further away. One of the last things that will develop by way of motor development is going to be the ability to pick small objects up, like a raisin, because the fingertips are far away from the spine. So it'll be one of the last things that we see when it comes to the sequences of development. So skill development is going to be tied to the infant's exercise of maturing muscles and nervous system. It's also going to be related to genes and culture. I mean, we've got to understand this. Cultures do have a great deal of impact on one's physical development. I mean, in some cultures, it is not unusual to see infants being carried around quite a bit on the front or the backs of their mothers. In our culture, we don't see that as often. So these things will have some sort of influence on one's development. Now, another aspect of physical development is going to be on memory, brain maturation, and infant memory. Rapid neuron growth disrupts old memory circuits, causing infantile amnesia. So, as the neurons are rapidly growing, then what we see is that there are things that we cannot remember because this major growth will disrupt memory circuits, causing infantile amnesia. Brain areas tied to memory continue to mature during adolescence. Now, what it comes down to is the following. If I asked you if you remember some situation or an event when you were 2 years old, and you said, yes, I remember it, most likely that would be an incorrect statement. And that most likely you should not be able to remember something that occurred when you were 2 years old. For example, it could simply be that you were told a story so many times about some event that occurred when you were 2 years old, and you sort of made a false memory based on that. One of the reasons for that is this. Brain areas such as the hippocampus, which we learned previously in chapter 2, that is responsible for taking things and solidifying them to place them into long-term memory so you have access to them later. Well, that's still continuing to mature and develop well into adolescence. So it's not developed enough yet for you to have those things placed into long-term memory. So what it comes down to is that there's going to be a blink of time that your memory is basically going to be a blank because you did not have or possess the equipment at the time in order to recall that memory. It was not stored properly. So we have rapid neuron growth causing this particular issue, as well as structures that are not fully mature yet causing this infantile amnesia. Now, the key thing is that your personal memory of things that you were involved in, what we call episodic memory, which we'll talk about in a later chapter, that is what the hippocampus will help you to store. But there are other things too. Infants can learn other things, and they can keep and maintain this learning. For example, infants in some research that was done learned and remembered that they can kick a mobile in order to entertain themselves. All right. So we see that memory, and we'll talk more about this later, is divided into different types of memory. So personal memory, you'll have this blank spot because you don't have the structure in place fully mature yet, and you have the rapid neuron growth that disrupt the memory circuits, so you can't remember the personal stuff. But things like how to do something that you've learned as you accidentally kick the mobile and you learn that that causes fun, you can learn and remember that. That's a very interesting thing that we'll see a little bit later in the course as well. So next we talk about cognitive development. And one individual who is very well known for cognitive development, thinking about and researching it, is Jean Piaget. Piaget's thinking and current thinking. Well, children construct their understanding of the world while they interact with it. Then we have this notion of mental models. Periods of change, stability, and movement to the next cognitive stage with distinctive characteristics and thinking are experienced. So the notion here is that how we interact with the world also aids in our cognitive development. So let's look at some core concepts related to this. First, there is cognition. Cognition, all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. Schema, the concept or framework that organizes and interprets information. Assimilation, interpreting our new experiences in terms of our existing schemas. And accommodation, adapting our current understandings or schemas to incorporate new information. So let's look at the first couple of stages here of Piaget's. So in the first stage, the sensory motor stage, which occurs from birth to around age 2, we're learning through senses and actions. We see that we are crawling around, touching things, picking things up, and that's going to be a key aspect of how it is that we are going to learn about our development, okay, to how we start to begin our thinking process. Now, we have the gradual unfolding at this time of object permanence. And object permanence is us understanding that once an object disappears from our sight, that it continues to exist. During this stage, early in this stage, we don't have that. Okay? We don't have this idea of object permanence. The idea is when we see something and then it's taken from our sight, as far as we're concerned, it just simply disappeared. Then we have the pre-operational stage. Things represented with words and images until around age 6 or 7. We're unable to perform mental operations. We are really very concrete minded here, so we can't do things which are abstract. So we're unable to perform mental operations. We have the lack of the concept of conservation as well. That means, for example, simply because something changes its shape does not mean that the amount or size has changed. Let me give you a real quick example. Let's say you babysit some younger kids. When you were younger, you babysit some younger kids, and you're told that you can give them some cookies or what have you at certain points during the day. There are 2 kids, and so you give them cookies. And one kid notices that their cookie is much smaller than the other kids. And let's say they're twins, okay? And so the idea is that they don't like this disparity. You take the cookie, the smaller cookie, and then you break it up into smaller pieces. And you say, here, I give you more cookies now. That kid at this particular stage may not really be able to comprehend that all you did was to break the same size cookie up. That's the same amount of cookie. In their mind, they could perceive it as being more cookie. All right, so symbolic thinking and pretend play appear earlier than Piaget would have predicted, according to some research. The inability to take a point of view of others is called egocentrism. Egocentrism. This is a key idea. It's not saying the kid is egocentric in the sense that you may be familiar with it. It's saying that they don't have the ability to see beyond themselves. They can't take another person's point of view. They don't understand it. So let's give you an example from a previous edition of the textbook here. Let's say you have Tom, little Tommy. He's a young boy who's in this pre-operational stage. And you ask little Tommy, do you have a brother? And little Tommy says, yes, I have a brother, Jim. All right, so that's good. Tommy knows that he has a brother, Jim. But then you may ask this same kid, does Jim have a brother? And he may say, no. Now that is kind of weird, right? Because if logic dictates that if Tom has Jim as a brother, then Jim has Tom as a brother. But think of what egocentrism is. The child can only see from their point of view. That's all they can see is their point of view. They cannot take another's point of view. So in this instance, Tommy knows Tommy's view because he's Tommy. But he does not and cannot take Jim's point of view because he's egocentric. This also leads to the other idea, the theory of mind. The theory of mind, it develops gradually during this stage, people's ideas about their own and others' mental state. So basically, when you are in this stage, you don't have a really clear theory of mind yet. You don't understand that other people have their own minds, that other people have their own feelings and own thoughts, their own perceptions. So it takes a little bit of a while for you to start to develop the theory of mind. Now you can see how egocentrism plays into this as well. So if you are not as egocentric, you realize that there's other points of view. When you start to do that, you're starting to establish a theory of mind, meaning that other people have a different point of view. Other people have their own minds, which you would imagine is a major thing for kids to realize that there are different points of view. So how do they do some research to indicate what babies know? Now, as I stated in the previous slide, where some things are not totally aligned with Piaget, as you read in your textbook, Piaget's original thinking, and some of this has been because of research like this, where we've been able to ascertain logically that babies may know more than they're able to communicate. Therefore, Piaget's timing about when people have certain cognitive abilities may be a little bit off. So 5-month-old babies did a double take or stared longer at this particular scenario here. So objects are placed in a case, a screen comes up, an empty hand enters, and one object is removed. Then they flip the screen down, and the 5-month-old babies will either see one of the following conditions. The screen drops, revealing an object, or the screen drops and reveals two objects. And what they've been able to demonstrate is that the babies who saw the impossible outcome, that there are now two objects there, even though one has been removed, they will stare at this much longer. The implication here is that they realize something is wrong with this picture. It's not conclusive, but it does suggest quite strongly that they have some understanding, more so than they're able to communicate because they're 5-month-old babies, but they know something is amiss. Piaget's stages, the concrete operational stage occurs from around age 7 to around 11 years of age. Here we see improved mental operations. We have the enabling of logical thinking about concrete events. We can see analogies can now be used. Then we see the comprehension of mathematical transformation and conservation. And again, if you recall your math classes during these particular ages, the math classes are aligned with your cognitive development. So we don't have math that goes beyond our cognitive development so that we are not able to do the math. We must have those aligned. Your cognitive development and the type of math that you're going to be able to perform are going to be aligned. So we see this in the concrete operational stages. Then we have formal operational stage, about 12 years old onward, all the way into adulthood. So here, reasoning about actual experiences evolves to include abstract thinking. So now you can imagine all sorts of possibilities. You don't have to have concrete examples in front of you. This is when, more likely, you'll be taking classes where you'll solve for X and Y. It initially includes imagined realities and symbols, then hypothetical propositions and deductions of consequences. So this is what we see, more formal operations. Now, one last thing before we end this particular segment. There are alternative viewpoints to cognitive development. One was introduced by Lev Vygotsky in The Social Child. Basically, a child's mind grows through interactions with the social environment. So we saw from Piaget's perspective, interacting with the environment, we saw that type of thing going on, but really didn't see a lot about the social environment. And this is where Lev Vygotsky is talking more about it. He's talking about the social environment. That through your interaction with the social environment, you learn. Scaffolding is one of the basic ideas. Scaffolding offers children temporary support as higher levels of thinking are developed between too easy and too difficult. For example, when you are socially interacting with individuals, they can help you through this social interaction to learn, to think things through at higher levels than you're used to. Language also facilitates social mentoring and provides the building blocks for thinking. So, in this regard, what we see is that Vygotsky is just offering an additional way to look at how it is that children develop. Now, think about to your own experiences, particularly if you are a child that had siblings as opposed to being an only child. Well, you learn things or can mislearn things even when you have other children around you. But also think about it if you are that only child. If you're the only child, and let's say you don't interact with children as you're developing and growing up, but you interact more with adults, do you imagine that the speaking for a child that is an only child that usually interacts mostly with adults, will they have greater speaking and language capabilities than those who may have lots of children in the household? Think about it. Well, the possibility is that the child that has a bunch of examples of how to speak, that is the only child, and they have only adult examples, their speaking may be a little bit more mature than those who have other children they hang out with. So here we see social environment, yes, does play a role in one's cognitive development. So let's look at what all this means from looking at Piaget's work here. So reflected on Piaget's theory, contributions. The identification of significant cognitive milestones is one of the key ones. Cognitive development sequence, how it is that we sequence through our cognitive development. And he stimulated interest in how the mind develops. There are criticisms. Some of the criticisms, development was more continuous than proposed, that we don't have these stages. Some things are much more gradual changes. The timing of types of thinking seen at earlier ages, as I indicated previously, is that we see from our current research or later research that children may be a little bit more advanced than Piaget may have initially surmised. So he most likely missed some conceptual abilities. And the implication for parents, things to consider. Young children are incapable of adult logic. It just doesn't work. Children's cognitive development is active, not passive. And early immaturity is adaptive. It allows for us to have to, watch after them and protect them and things of that nature. Okay, we'll stop there for now.